The crystal spires of the Asterian royal palace pierced the violet sky like frozen lightning, their surfaces reflecting the twin suns in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Damien Cross kept his eyes fixed on the polished obsidian floor instead, following 3 paces behind Ambassador Hartwell as their diplomatic entourage made its way through corridors that seemed to bend reality itself. "Remember your place, Cross," Hartwell had hissed before they entered the palace grounds. "You're here as a translator, nothing more. After what happened at the university, you're lucky to have any position at all." The reminder stung, but Damien had learned to swallow such barbs. 6 months ago, he'd been Professor Damien Cross, renowned linguist and author of 3 definitive texts on interstellar communication theory. Then came the accusations of falsifying research data, the academic tribunal, the destruction of his reputation. The evidence against him had been circumstantial but damning, and his protests of innocence had fallen on deaf ears. Now he was nobody, a disgraced scholar, reduced to translating simple diplomatic pleasantries for a government that saw him as barely useful enough to exile rather than imprison. The throne room doors opened with a sound like singing crystal, revealing a chamber that defied architectural logic. The ceiling soared impossibly high, supported by pillars of living light that pulsed in rhythm with some cosmic heartbeat. At the far end, Queen Valerina sat upon a throne carved from a single massive sapphire, her silver hair flowing like starlight against the deep blue of her ceremonial robes. But it wasn't the queen who captured Damien's attention. Standing to the left of the throne was a young woman who couldn't have been more than 22 in Earth years. Her dark hair was woven with threads of actual silver that caught the light with every slight movement of her head. She wore a gown of deep emerald that complemented her pale skin, and her posture held the refined grace that spoke of royal breeding. Princess Celeste. Damien recognized her from the diplomatic briefings, though the dry official descriptions had failed to capture the quiet intensity in her violet eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. "Your Majesty," Ambassador Hartwell began, executing the elaborate bow he'd practiced for weeks. "The Earth Coalition sends greetings and hopes for continued peace between our peoples." As the ambassador launched into his prepared speech about trade agreements and mutual defense pacts, Damien found his attention drawn to the princess. There was something in the way she held herself, the slight tilt of her head, the manner in which her eyes tracked the speakers' mouths rather than meeting their gaze directly. The realization hit him like a physical blow. She was deaf. He watched as the formal proceedings continued around her, noting how no one made any attempt to include her in the conversation. No interpreter signed for her benefit. No one even acknowledged her presence beyond the occasional ceremonial nod. She stood there like a beautiful statue, isolated in her silence while the fate of worlds was discussed mere feet away. Damien had spent years studying human and alien communication methods. He'd written his doctoral thesis on the development of sign languages across different species. He knew a dozen variants of Terran Sign Language, had pioneered several alien adaptations, and understood the profound isolation that came with being cut off from the primary communication methods of one society. His hands moved before his conscious mind could stop them. It was a simple gesture, one he'd learned during his research into pre-space Earth cultures. His fingers formed the ancient American Sign Language signs slowly, carefully. "Hello, beautiful day." The effect was instantaneous and devastating. Princess Celeste's carefully maintained composure cracked like ice under pressure. Her violet eyes widened, filling with tears that she couldn't blink away fast enough. One hand flew to cover her mouth, and a sound escaped, half sob, half laugh, that echoed through the throne room like a bell tolling. The entire chamber fell silent. Ambassador Hartwell's voice cut off mid-sentence. Every head turned toward the sound and swiveled to locate its source. The palace guards' hands moved instinctively toward the elegant energy weapons at their sides. while court officials exchanged bewildered glances. Queen Valerina rose from her throne with fluid grace, her expression unreadable as she looked from her daughter to Damien. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly through the sudden silence, though she didn't raise it above a whisper. "You." Her translator scrambled to keep up with the Queen's words. "The quiet one in the back. Come forward." Damien's stomach clenched as if he'd been punched. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was supposed to be invisible, forgotten, a piece of diplomatic furniture that occasionally proved useful for translation. He'd violated the first rule of court protocol: never draw attention to yourself unless explicitly invited. But he had no choice now. Every eye in the room was upon him, and refusing a direct royal command would create an international incident. Damien stepped forward, his academic training keeping his stride steady despite the weight of dozens of alien gazes. He stopped at what he judged to be the appropriate distance and offered a respectful bow, not the elaborate genuflection that Hartwell had performed, but a simple inclination of his head that acknowledged authority without groveling. "You made signs to my daughter," Queen Valerina said. It wasn't a question. Damien hesitated. Speaking without permission could make things infinitely worse, but lying to a monarch who undoubtedly had access to truth detection technology would be suicidal. "I did, Your Majesty," he said simply, his voice carrying despite his effort to keep it level. "These signs, what are they?" "A form of communication from my world, Your Majesty. A language of hands and gestures, used by those who cannot hear, or in situations where silence is required." The Queen descended from her throne, moving with the predatory grace of someone accustomed to absolute power. She approached until she stood mere feet from Damien, close enough that he could see the intricate patterns of silver threading through her hair, the subtle luminescence that seemed to emanate from her skin. "Show me again," she commanded. "What you said to her." Damien raised his hands, moving through the signs more slowly this time, acutely aware that Princess Celeste was watching his every movement with desperate attention. "Hello, beautiful day." He paused, then added, "I meant no disrespect, Your Majesty. I simply saw my daughter's isolation and chose to bridge it," the Queen finished. "Do you understand what you've done?" Damien straightened, meeting those impossible violet eyes directly. "I saw someone who needed to be seen, Your Majesty. That's all." A long moment passed. The throne room seemed to hold its breath, suspended in crystal silence. Then, impossibly, Queen Valerina smiled an expression that transformed her face from merely beautiful to radiant. "Lord Blackthorn," she called, and a figure emerged from the shadows beside the throne. The Queen's advisor was tall and imposing, with the pale skin and silver hair characteristic of his species, but his eyes held a coldness that spoke of calculated intelligence and deep suspicion. "Clear the room," the Queen continued. "Everyone except our Earth guests." The throne room emptied with remarkable efficiency, leaving only the human delegation, the royal family, and Lord Blackthorn. Princess Celeste had moved closer during the exodus, her eyes never leaving Damien's hands, as if she were afraid the magic would disappear if she looked away. "Can you teach her more?" Queen Valerina asked, and for the first time, Damien heard something beyond royal command in her voice. He heard a mother's desperate hope. "Your Majesty," Ambassador Hartwell interjected, finally finding his voice. "This man is merely a translator, hardly qualified to—" "This man," the Queen cut him off, "just accomplished what none of my scholars, physicians, or technicians could manage in 22 years. He spoke to my daughter in a way she could understand." She turned back to Damien. "I ask again, can you teach her?" Damien looked at Princess Celeste. She was attempting to sign something clumsily, incorrectly, but signing nonetheless. She'd picked up his simple greeting and was trying to return it, her fingers moving through approximations of the gestures. When she finished, she looked at him with such naked hope that it nearly broke his heart. Yes, he said quietly. I can teach her. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and danger. Ambassador Hartwell's face had gone pale, while Lord Blackthorn's expression promised complications that Damien couldn't yet imagine. But Princess Celeste was smiling now, the first genuine expression of joy he'd seen from her, and her fingers were already moving, trying to learn, trying to communicate. In that moment, Damien realized that his exile had just become something else entirely, something that might be the beginning of redemption or the path to even greater ruin. But as he watched the princess struggle with her first attempts at sign language, he found he didn't care about the consequences. For the first time in months, he had a purpose that mattered. A morning light filtering through the crystal walls of Damien's new quarters painted rainbow patterns across surfaces that defied Earth physics. He'd spent most of the night reviewing his knowledge of sign language adaptation, trying to figure out how to modify Terran ISL for beings with longer, more delicate fingers and different cultural contexts. The Asterians' hands were similar enough to human hands that basic signs would work, but the nuances of grammar and expression would need careful adjustment. A soft chime announced a visitor. Damien expected a servant, perhaps Lord Blackthorn with new restrictions or warnings. Instead, Princess Celeste stood in the doorway, flanked by a single guard whose discomfort was obvious in every line of his posture. She wore a simple dress of deep blue that brought out the violet in her eyes, and her dark hair was braided with silver threads that caught the morning light. In her hands, she carried what appeared to be a data tablet, though, like everything Asterian, it was far more elegant than its human equivalent. A sheet of crystalline material that displayed holographic text. "Good morning," she signed, the gesture still clumsy but recognizable. Then, with less certainty, she added what he realized was her attempt at teacher. "Good morning, Princess," Damien signed back, speaking the words aloud for the benefit of the guard. "And please, just call me Damien when we're working together." Her eyes widened at the informality. Then she smiled, that radiant expression that transformed her entire face. She showed him the data tablet, pointing to words in Asterian script, then looking at him with obvious questions. "You want to know how to sign these concepts?" Damien asked. When she nodded eagerly, he gestured toward the small seating area by the crystal windows. "Let's start with the basics, then work our way up to more complex ideas." The guard, a young man named Jorik, as Damien learned, positioned himself by the door with the resigned air of someone expecting a very long day. Damien couldn't blame him. Palace guards were trained for threats they could fight, not for chaperoning language lessons. They began with simple concepts: family, home, happiness, sadness. Celeste was a quick student, her fingers adapting to the new movements with surprising grace. But more than that, she brought an intensity to the learning that spoke of years of pent-up need to communicate. "This sign," she attempted, her fingers forming an approximation of beautiful. "For flowers? For art? For ... double quotes," she paused, looking directly at him with an expression that made his heart skip. "For people?" "It can be used for all of those," Damien replied, acutely aware of the warmth in her gaze. Context matters in sign language just as it does in spoken language. She practiced the sign, then pointed toward the window where the palace gardens sprawled in impossible geometric perfection. "Beautiful," she signed, then turned that same gaze on him. The meaning was unmistakable, and Damien felt heat rise in his cheeks. "Princess," he began, but she held up a hand, stopping him. "Celeste," she signed. When we worked together, just Celeste. The casualness of her request, the way she mirrored his earlier informality, created an intimacy that felt dangerous and wonderful in equal measure. They were princess and commoner, alien and human, royal heir and disgraced exile. But in this moment, they were simply teacher and student. Two people bridging the gap between worlds with nothing but their hands and their growing understanding of each other. Their lesson was interrupted by the arrival of Captain Jackson Red, head of palace security. Reed was imposing, even by Asterian standards tall, broad-shouldered, with the silver hair of his species, worn in a military cut that emphasized the sharp angles of his face. His eyes, a striking shade of pale blue, missed nothing as they swept the room. "Princess," he said with a respectful bow, "your mother requests your presence in the blue salon. Lady Vivian has arrived for her weekly visit." Celeste's expression soured at the mention of Lady Vivian. She turned to Damien and signed something rapid and complex, too fast for him to follow completely. But he caught the signs for boring talk and what might have been politics. "The princess finds Lady Vivian's visits tedious," Captain Red translated with what might have been amusement. "She's asking if you'll continue the lesson later." "Of course," Damien replied, speaking aloud while signing. "We can meet this afternoon if you'd like." As Celeste prepared to leave, she turned back and signed, "Thank you," followed by something he didn't recognize. At his puzzled expression, she repeated it more slowly. "It's her name sign for you," Reed explained. In Asterian gesture language, people who are close create personal signs for each other. It's significant. The personal sign she'd created combined the gesture for teacher with something that looked like bridge, a bridge builder, a connector of worlds. The intimacy of having a personal sign, of being important enough to her that she'd created one, hit him like a physical force. After she left, Reed lingered. "Walk with me," he said, and it wasn't quite a request. They moved through corridors that Damien was beginning to recognize, though the palace's architecture still played tricks on his human perception. Rooms that should have been adjacent were separated by long hallways, while spaces that appeared distant could be reached in just a few steps. "You're causing quite a stir," Reed said as they walked. "Half the court thinks you're a miracle worker. The other half thinks you're a spy or worse." "And you?" Damien asked. Reed was quiet for a moment, considering. "I think you're exactly what you appear, to be a man who saw someone in need and acted on instinct. But that doesn't mean you're safe here. The court has its own ecosystem, its own predators and prey. You've disrupted that balance." They stopped at a balcony overlooking the palace gardens. Below, Damien could see Celeste walking with an older Asterian woman whose elaborate dress and imperious posture marked her as nobility. Even from this distance, he could read the tension in Celeste's shoulders. "Lady Vivian," Reed said, following his gaze. "She's been advocating for the princess to marry her nephew, Prince Aldrich of the Centauri courts. A political alliance that would strengthen both realms. And the princess has shown about as much interest in Prince Aldrich as she has in learning advanced quantum mechanics." Reed's tone was dry. "But Lady Vivian is persistent. She sees your influence on the princess as a threat to her plans." As if summoned by their conversation, a woman below looked up toward their balcony. Even at this distance, Damien could feel the weight of her disapproval. "Be careful," Reed warned. "Lady Vivian has considerable influence at court. She's already been asking pointed questions about your background, your qualifications, your intentions regarding the princess." That afternoon, Damien waited in the small classroom that had been prepared for their lessons. It was a beautiful space with walls of translucent crystal that could display any environment currently showing a peaceful earth forest that reminded him painfully of home. Celeste arrived precisely on time, but her usual brightness was dimmed. She moved through their greetings mechanically, her signs lacking their usual enthusiasm. "What's wrong?" Damien asked, concerned. She hesitated, then began signing rapidly. It was a mixture of a SL and her own improvised gestures, emotional and fragmented. He caught references to marriage, duty, choices, and something that might have been prison, Lady Vivian spoke to you about Prince Aldrich, he guessed. Celeste nodded, her expression miserable. She signed something else, and this time he understood perfectly. I don't want to marry someone I've never spoken to. The simple statement hit him harder than it should have. Of course, she would be expected to make a political marriage. She was a princess, heir to a throne. Her personal desires would always be secondary to the needs of the realm. What do you want? He asked gently. She looked at him for a long moment, her violet eyes searching his face. Then she signed, to choose, to have a voice in my own life, to be seen as more than just a symbol. You are more than that, Damien said, and meant it. You're brilliant, curious kind. Anyone who can't see that doesn't deserve you. The words hung between them, more intimate than he'd intended. Celeste stepped closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of silver in her eyes, the way her lips parted slightly as if she wanted to speak. Damien, she said aloud, her voice soft and slightly accented but clear. It was the first time he'd heard her speak, and the sound of his name in her voice sent electricity through him. You can speak, he said, startled. Some, she replied, still speaking rather than signing. Hard to control. But your name, double quotes. She paused, searching for words. I practice. Important to say right. The fact that she'd been practicing speaking his name, that it mattered enough to her to work at making the sounds correctly, overwhelmed him. Without thinking, he reached out to touch her face, his fingers tracing the line of her cheek. Celeste, he whispered. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing for a moment. When she opened them again, they were bright with unshed tears. I know, she signed, her hands moving slowly. Impossible. I am princess. You are teacher. But I feel double quotes. I feel it too, he admitted. They stood there in the crystal classroom, surrounded by the illusion of an earth forest, two beings from different worlds acknowledging the impossible thing growing between them. The rational part of Damien's mind screamed warnings about treason, about the consequences of falling in love with an alien princess. But his heart had already made its choice. A sound from the doorway broke the spell. Lord Blackthorne stood there, his pale eyes taking in their proximity, their expressions, the obvious intimacy of the moment. Princess, he said smoothly, your mother requests your immediate presence. There has been a development regarding the Centauri delegation. Celeste stepped back, her royal composure sliding into place like armor. But before she left, she turned to Damien and signed. This isn't finished. After she was gone, Blackthorne remained, studying Damien with calculating eyes. You're playing a dangerous game, Professor Cross, he said finally. The princess may be charmed by your talents, but you would do well to remember your place here. You are a teacher, nothing more. Any attempt to overstep that role will be dealt with harshly. I understand my position, Damien replied carefully. Do you? Blackthorne stepped closer, his presence somehow making the spacious room feel cramped. Because from where I stand, it appears you've forgotten that you're a guest here, a very precarious guest whose continued welcome depends entirely on your usefulness and proper behavior. The threat was unmistakable. Damien nodded, keeping his expression neutral. Of course, Lord Blackthorne. I'm simply here to help the princess communicate. See that you remember that, Blackthorne said. He paused at the doorway. Oh, and Professor? The princes will be dining with Prince Aldrich tomorrow evening. I trust you won't find it necessary to interrupt that meal with any educational emergencies. Alone in the classroom, Damien slumped into his chair. The illusion of the earth forest mocked him with its peaceful beauty, so far from the political minefield he found himself navigating. He was falling in love with a princess who was promised to another, in a court where his very presence was barely tolerated. But when he closed his eyes, He could still feel the warmth of her cheek against his palm, could still see the way she'd looked at him when she spoke his name. Whatever the consequences, whatever the dangers, he knew there was no going back now. The language of hearts, he reflected, was far more dangerous than any words they might share with their hands. 3 days had passed since Lord Blackthorn's warning, and Damien hadn't seen Celeste except at a distance during formal court functions. She stood beside Prince Aldrich at state dinners, walked with him through the gardens during carefully orchestrated promenades, and smiled politely at his attempts at conversation. To any observer, she appeared to be the perfect princess, graciously accepting her suitor's attentions. But Damien could read the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands stayed rigidly at her sides instead of moving in the expressive gestures that had become natural to her. She was performing a role, and it was clearly costing her. He'd thrown himself into research, spending long hours in the palace's vast library complex. The repository of knowledge, as it was formerly known, was a marvel that defied conventional architecture. Information was stored in formats ranging from traditional crystalline matrices to quantum probability clouds that shifted and reformed based on the researcher's needs. Master Thorn, the chief librarian, had taken pity on Damien's obvious frustration with the alien systems and provided him with a personal guide interface. "Fascinating research you're conducting," a voice said behind him, causing Damien to nearly drop the data crystal he'd been examining. Master Thorn approached through the stacks, his pale robes rustling softly against the floor. He was ancient even by Asterian standards, his silver hair having long since faded to white, but his violet eyes remained sharp and knowing. "I'm just trying to understand the linguistic development patterns of your people," Damien replied carefully. "To better adapt human sign language for Asterian use, of course," Thorn said, but there was something in his tone that suggested he saw through the partial truth. "Though I notice you've been particularly interested in historical communication methods used during times of political sensitivity." Damien froze. He had indeed been researching covert communication techniques, driven by an instinct he couldn't quite name. There was something happening in the palace currents beneath the surface that reminded him of the political machinations he'd witnessed during his academic career. "Knowledge is never dangerous in itself," Thorn continued, settling into a chair across from Damien. "Only the use to which it's put. What troubles you, young scholar?" The old librarian's manner invited confidence, and Damien found himself speaking more freely than he'd intended. "There are patterns here I don't understand. Political currents that seem to run deeper than a simple arranged marriage. I feel like I'm missing something important." Thorn was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the crystalline surface of the table. "You have good instincts," he said finally. "The princess has been observant over the years. Being unable to participate in conversations made her an excellent watcher and reader of people. She's seen things others have missed." "What kind of things?" Before Thorn could answer, a soft chime indicated someone approaching. Princess Celeste materialized from between the stacks, moving with the silent grace she'd perfected over years of going unnoticed. She looked tired, and there were shadows under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. "Your Highness," Thorn said, rising with a respectful bow. "I was just discussing linguistic research with Professor Cross." Celeste glanced around the library, confirming they were alone, then approached their table. Instead of speaking aloud or using formal signs, she pulled out her data tablet and began typing rapidly. When she finished, she showed them the screen. "We need to talk. All of us, but not here. Too many listening devices. Meet me in the old archive section in 1 hour. Master Thorn knows the way." After she left, Thorn sat back down with a sigh. "She's been investigating something for weeks. I've been helping her access historical records, though I'm not entirely certain what she's looking for." "And you're willing to help us?" The old librarian's eyes glittered with something that might have been mischief. "I've been keeper of this repository for over 2 centuries. I've seen 3 different dynasties, 4 major wars, and countless political intrigues. The one constant has been that the truth, however inconvenient, eventually surfaces. Better to help it along than to let it explode unexpectedly." An hour later, Damien followed Master Thorn through sections of the library he hadn't known existed. They descended through levels that seemed to predate the current palace, past archives that held the accumulated knowledge of millennia. The air grew cooler and more still the deeper they went, until they reached a chamber where silence felt absolute. Celeste was waiting for them, but she wasn't alone. Captain Reed stood beside her, his expression grim. On the table before them was an array of data crystals and holographic displays that painted an ominous picture. "Thank you for coming," Celeste said aloud, her voice soft but clear in the perfect acoustics of the chamber. "I need to show you something." She activated the first display, and images began cycling through the air above the table. Financial records, communication logs, shipping manifests, all seemingly routine documents that meant nothing to Damien. "I don't understand," he said. "Look at the patterns," Reed said. "The timing, the recipients, the amounts involved." Celeste moved to stand beside Damien, close enough that he could smell the subtle floral scent she wore. She began signing as she spoke, her hands adding emphasis and nuance that her voice couldn't quite capture. "For the past year, someone has been systematically moving resources out of the royal treasury," she explained. "Small amounts, carefully disguised as routine expenditures. But when you add them up, she gestured, and the display showed a sum that made Damien whistle low. "That's enough to fund a small army," he said. "Or a rebellion," Reed added grimly. "We've also been tracking unauthorized communications with off-world groups that have no official diplomatic relations with Asteria." Master Thorn manipulated one of the displays, bringing up a communication log. "These messages are encoded, but the pattern suggests they're coordinating something significant. Something timed to coincide with the Stellar Festival." The Stellar Festival was Asteria's most important celebration, when dignitaries from across the galaxy would gather in the capital. It was also when Princess Celeste's engagement to Prince Aldrich was scheduled to be officially announced. "You think someone is planning to disrupt the festival?" Damien asked. "I think someone is planning to use the festival as cover for something much worse," Celeste signed, her movements sharp with anxiety. "But I can't figure out who or what exactly they're planning." Reed activated another display, showing palace security footage for the past several weeks. "We've been monitoring Lord Blackthorn's activities. He's been meeting with people who aren't in the official visitor logs, having conversations in areas where recording is supposedly impossible." "Supposedly?" Damien asked. Celeste smiled for the first time since they'd gathered. "One advantage of being ignored for years, you learn all the places where people think they can't be watched, and you develop creative ways of watching them anyway." She showed them a device that looked like a simple piece of jewelry, a silver bracelet, set with what appeared to be decorative crystals. "Micro-recording arrays," she explained. "I've been wearing different pieces to various court functions, gathering intelligence on conversations that people thought were private." "That's incredibly dangerous," Damien said, though he couldn't help but admire her courage. "Less dangerous than letting whatever they're planning proceed unchallenged," she replied. Master Thorn leaned forward, his ancient features creased with concern. "What you've discovered is deeply troubling, but it's still largely circumstantial. We need more concrete evidence before we can act." "I know," Celeste said. "That's why I need your help." She turned to Damien. "You understand codes, patterns, and communication. Your academic work involved analyzing linguistic structures to reveal hidden meanings. You want me to help decode their messages?" "More than that," Reed said. "We need someone who can get close to the source. Someone who wouldn't be suspected of espionage. The engagement celebration, Celeste continued, is being planned by a committee that includes Lord Blackthorn and several other suspects. They need a linguistic consultant to help coordinate communications between all the different diplomatic delegations. Damien saw where this was leading. You want me to volunteer for the committee? It's perfect cover, Reed said. You're already known as a language specialist. Your presence would be expected and unremarkable. But you'd have access to their planning sessions, their communications protocols. And if I'm caught? The question hung heavy in the air. They all knew the consequences of being discovered in espionage against the Crown's own advisors. Then we all face the consequences together, Celeste said simply. But if we do nothing, and whatever they're planning succeeds during the festival ... She didn't need to finish. The Stellar Festival would host representatives from dozens of worlds. If something happened during the celebration, it could destabilize the entire region, potentially restart conflicts that had taken decades to resolve. There's something else, Master Thorn said quietly. Something I discovered while researching the historical precedents for what we're seeing. This pattern of resource diversion, secret communications, manipulation of succession ceremonies, it's all happened before. He activated a final display, showing historical records from nearly a century ago. The last time these exact tactics were used, it preceded a coup attempt that nearly destroyed the royal house. The perpetrators waited until the maximum number of foreign dignitaries were present, then struck during the ceremony itself. Maximum chaos, maximum witnesses, Reed said grimly. If they succeeded in eliminating the royal family during such a public event, they could claim it was an attack by foreign enemies, position themselves as the rightful successors who would restore order. Celeste moved closer to Damien, her hand finding his arm. I know what I'm asking, she said, switching back to sign language for privacy, despite their trusted company. I know the risks, but I can't sit by and watch while someone destroys everything my family has built, and I can't sit by and watch them destroy you, he signed back, covering her hand with his own. The admission hung between them, more intimate than any spoken declaration of love. In that moment, surrounded by ancient archives and evidence of treachery, they were no longer teacher and student, human and alien, commoner and princess. They were simply two people who had found something worth protecting in each other. I'll do it, Damien said aloud. I'll join the planning committee. Reed nodded approvingly. Good. The next committee meeting is tomorrow. I'll arrange for your appointment to be suggested by Queen Valerina herself. That way no one can question your presence. As they prepared to leave, gathering the evidence they'd assembled and preparing to return to their normal routines, Celeste lingered beside Damien. Whatever happens, she signed, whatever we discover or where this leads, I'm glad you're here. I'm glad I'm not facing this alone. You'll never face anything alone again, he promised. Not if I can help it. She smiled, and for a moment, the weight of conspiracy and danger lifted. They were simply two people who had found love in an impossible situation, and that love gave them strength for whatever was coming. But as they made their way back through the ancient archives toward the palace above, none of them noticed the small surveillance device that had been carefully placed among the historical records, a device that had captured every word of their conversation. In his private chambers, Lord Blackthorn reviewed the recording with cold satisfaction. The princess was more observant than he'd given her credit for, and her human teacher was proving to be a more significant threat than anticipated. But their investigation, however clever, had just played directly into his hands. Soon, very soon, they would all understand just how carefully this game had been planned, and how thoroughly they had been outmaneuvered. The Stellar Festival would indeed be memorable, just not in the way they expected. The final phase was about to begin.